Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the second lecture in this series about St Colmcille and books, which has been organised by Donegal County Library Service to commemorate the 1500th anniversary of the birth of St Colmcille. And I just want to thank the Library Service for the invitation to speak, and especially to Matthewson, who has been my contact at the library. This is the second lecture in the series. In the first series, first lecture, we talked about the three written lives, the medieval lives of St Colmcille. And of course, Colmcille is connected in many ways with books and writing and so on. And today we're going to look at the manuscript tradition associated with the saint. And I will maybe use a couple of words. Just one second, I'll bring up the slides. Excuse me for a second. I've lost my anyway, we'll just proceed. I'm just going to I've lost my anyway, we'll just keep going. I'll probably be using a number of technical words: manuscripts, copies of manuscripts, texts, and recensions. And there is a distinction being made between, if you like, a manuscript and a text. And obviously, a copy of a manuscript is just a copy, but it can be, in many instances, a much later copy. A text then is a written piece of work. It can be, for instance, the life of St Columba, but there were maybe many variations of that, and we call those recensions. I just wanted to, before we get into the kind of main part of the lecture, to refer to the kind of dates that are relevant. We used to think Colmcille was born in 521. Now we think it's 520, but that hardly matters. That he went to Scotland in what we now think is 562, and that the Monastery of Iona was founded in 963. And he died in the year then 593, although 597 was the year that we used to think. Now, in the previous lecture, I mentioned that we're having trouble with technical trouble, but let's keep. My apologies for the technical problems. There we go. In the previous lecture, I mentioned that in the 19th century, Dr. William Reeves, the Church of Ireland bishop, he did a survey of sites in Ireland and Scotland connected with Colmcille, and he came up with about 56 in Scotland and 37 in Ireland. And one of the sites, I'm afraid my pointer isn't working, and one of the sites in Scotland was a place up in northeast Scotland called Port Mahamock, Port Mahamock in English. And it was probably a Columban monastic site, but there have been major excavations there over the last 10 years or so, and they have revealed magnificent evidence for the production of books. And this is germane to what we're talking about. I also mentioned that there were sites in England, and I particularly mentioned Lindisfarne in the northeast of England, just north of Newcastle upon Tyne, and that the manuscripts and the traditions of Columba associated with Lindisfarne passed then down to Durham Cathedral, and where many of those are preserved. So the arrow points to Iona, the monastery founded by Columba in about 563. And Iona then becomes one of the major cultural centers, not only a religious center, but cultural center, artistic center, scientific center, political center, all these things rolled into one. But it was also a major place for the production of manuscripts. Now, when you go to Iona now, there isn't very much there to be seen from the original monastery, because in the middle of the, at the beginning of the 13th century, about 1200, a huge new medieval abbey was built on the site of the ancient monastery, which is in the center of your screen just there. But just a little to the west of Iona Abbey, as it is now, there is a little hill called Torranab, the hill of the abbot. And archaeological excavations there have revealed a hut. And we know that Columcille had a hut overlooking the main monastery, where he did most of his writing. So the Torranab would seem to be that site, although we can't be absolutely certain. As I said, if you go to Iona now, there's very little from the original monastery, but just behind the cross there, you can see this little hillock that we call Torranab. And Iona was the center of a major artistic renaissance, if you like, including the erection of these magnificent crosses. And the same sort of decoration on the crosses was also used in manuscripts, the important manuscripts, which we'll talk about later on. Now, I often use this little quotation. This is the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron. He was speaking at Stormont on the 9th of June, which is Columcille's feast day in the year 2011. And this is just something he said. He says, "It is an honor to address you on such an auspicious day, the 9th of June. This is the feast day of St Columba, who very specially symbolizes the historic linkages and deep bonds between Britain and Ireland. Born a prince in Donegal, exiled in Iona, honored today in the central lobby of the Palace of Westminster. His monks provided not just an Irish national treasure, the Book of Kells, but also a British national treasure, the Lindisfarne Gospels." And Lindisfarne is, as I say, a little island off the northeast coast of England, north of Newcastle upon Tyne, founded by the man that is depicted in the statue, St Aidan, who was a monk sent from Iona. And Lindisfarne became almost like a mini version of Iona in relation to England, just as Iona was in relation to Scotland and Ireland. Lindisfarne had a similar role in relation to England. And amongst the many treasures produced at Lindisfarne was the Book of Lindisfarne, or the Lindisfarne Gospels. And this is just one single page from the Lindisfarne Gospels, what we call a carpet page, for obvious reasons. It looks like a Persian carpet or something like that. But the Lindisfarne Gospels was an immensely important, and it still is, if you like, the English equivalent of the Book of Kells. Now, in terms of writing, again, I mentioned this yesterday, the Columcille comes at the point in Irish history where, in fact, we are changing from prehistoric times, the times when there's no written material, to the historic times, the times from which we get writing, and with it history. And on Iona, the monks, the very first things the monks did, and it's not widely known, but the very first things the monks did was they began to keep a record, a chronicle, and we call that the Iona Chronicle. And it is the major source, in fact, it's the only real source we have for contemporary events between the period about 560 to 740. And then from the Iona Chronicle, copied into much later manuscripts, are from those comes texts such as the Annals of Ulster, Annals of Tigernach, and so on, and of course here in Donegal, the Annals of Four Masters. And that's just a page from the Annals of Ulster. What you're looking at there dates to about 1500, but it incorporates copies from the original Iona Chronicle. And again, the same is true of the Annals of Four Masters. The Annals of Four Masters date to about 1630 or thereabouts. But it incorporates material copied from the much more ancient Chronicle of Iona. And I mentioned in the previous lecture, because the monks copied and wrote down these things, we're now able to, this is just a kind of really not much more than a joke. I just counted there the plagues and pandemics that occurred during the life of Columcille himself. Some of them are very serious, and but I haven't time to go into all that detail. But you can see there, and we only know that because the monks in Iona wrote this down. They wrote a record of these events. And again, yesterday I used this little poem to indicate that, you know, the tradition that Columcille was a writer of many books is recorded in that little poem. The poem itself states from the 16th century, but it records this tradition of Columcille as a writer. And we, in Adamnan's Life of Columba, written about the year 700, and we talked about that in the last lecture, one of the things he tells us in the last chapter of the book is about the last days and death of St Colmcille. And one of the things he tells us there was that just before he died, the very last thing Columcille was doing before he died was that he was copying the manuscripts. Sorry, he was copying a manuscript of the Psalms, I should have said. He was copying the Psalms. And we have in the collection in Ireland a very ancient copy of the Psalms. This is it. It's known as the Cathach, a manuscript which it seems to have acquired that name, the Battle Book or something like that, something along those lines, from the O'Donnell family who owned it, O'Donnell's Donegal, in the later Middle Ages. That is after, say, after about 1100, 1200. But the manuscript itself seems to date to about 600, or maybe a little bit before, maybe a little bit after, depending on the latest theories from the scholars studying it. It sort of shifts a little bit. But by tradition, and I have to say it's only a tradition, this was actually written by Columcille. We can't prove that, neither can we disprove it at the moment. But it is a very early version of the Psalms, and it's very sparsely decorated, just the capital letters there. I'm sorry, I've lost my pointer on this, but to show you. But there you have the capital letter M. And the word, in fact, that follows it, the word that is the capital is misericordia, mercy. And often people often talk about this that it seems to indicate sort of doleful eyes, merciful eyes, or eyes maybe seeking mercy. And so the artist who made that is, as it were, drawing his inspiration from the word itself. And we'll see that another. The style of the decoration is known as Celtic Latin. And that is very early. It's very early. It's comes from the European Iron Age, and and that is an indication of how early this manuscript itself is. Now, about year 1090, this box was made. This shrine box, jeweled shrine box, was made to hold the manuscript of the Cathach, and it just shows how much the Cathach was revered as a relic of the saint himself, as something that people at least believed at the time had actually written by the saint himself. And on the Cathach, box, the shrine box, there's this little prayer written, a prayer for Coffer O'Donnell, who had this shrine made, and for Citric, son of Machada, who made it, and for Donald MacRorty, the abbot of Kells, who had it made. And we know that the Kells in County Meath was one of the great Columban monasteries of slightly later period. It wasn't actually founded by Columba, but and Citric was one of the master craftsmen who worked there. Now, we have various other ancient copies of the Psalms from Ireland. This, for instance, is a copy of about the same time as the Cathach, but it's not written on vellum as the Cathach itself is. This one is written on wax and on wooden boards onto which wax has been. And this is what it looks like when you open it out. And we know that this was a very common way. Vellum itself was very expensive, if you like, in terms, and not always easy to produce. And wax was used. For instance, Adamnan wrote a great book. We'll talk more about Adamnan later, but Adamnan wrote a great book about the Holy Land. And he tells us that he initially wrote it on wax, and he actually had drawings, or he himself or somebody else made drawings of the churches of Jerusalem again in wax, and then later on that was transferred to vellum. And we have another ancient copy of the Psalms. This is called the Faddenmore Psalter. It comes from a bog in the Midlands, and it was miraculously saved. It was found in the course of turf cutting and cutting of the bog, and was miraculously saved. And it consisted, the Cathach and other early manuscripts are stitched together like books. But this was more in the form of like what we now think of as the files inside, and was inside this folder. This is the folder that held the Faddenmore Psalter. So inside that there were the individual pages on the vellum. So in other words, we have a number of copies of the Psalms from very early in Irish history, and Adamnan tells us that the very last thing that Columcille was doing before he died was copying, making a copy of the Psalms. Anyway, this is the other pages from the Cathach, and you can see there that the pages of vellum is lined. There are lines sort of inscribed into it, and then there are the text is written accordingly, actually on the line rather than above or below the line. And then each section is introduced by an initial letter, and above the letter, not very clear on that slide, so maybe I have a better one. It's not clear on that either, but above the initial, there is what we call the rubrics, are red. There are headings in red, and they give from that we get the word rubrics. And here again you see a wonderful initial. This is Dominus, the Lord, DS, if you like, a contraction of Dominus. And it again decorated in this distinctive, very distinctive Latin style from the European Iron Age. Now, for the most part, the decoration derives from this pagan Iron Age, but other Christian symbols are beginning to enter into the style. And here, for instance, you can see on some of these headings the cross, and there are various types of crosses. In this instance, you have a combination, which occurs very often, a combination of a Greek cross. A Greek cross is one with equal arms, and a Latin cross. A Latin cross is the cross with the long stem. And for instance, that's to be found, the same thing is to be found on the wonderful cross slab up at Fawn in Iona. So this is the beginnings of the appearance of the cross in Irish art. And there you see, again, two crosses, Greek crosses, equal arm crosses from County Sligo of roughly the same date. But an earlier symbol for Christianity was a fish, and here you can see a cross on a fish, as it were. And interestingly, here's more or less the same motif from Coptic, from Egypt, in other words, from a piece of art from Egypt of somewhat earlier than the Cathach. But you can see that these motifs are being drawn from, all the way out here to Ireland and to Scotland, from the Eastern Mediterranean world. And so that's the Cathach of roughly about the 600s. It's a very sparsely decorated, but it's one of the oldest decorated manuscript we have. And then, yes, in the earlier lecture, I talked about the Adamnan's Vita Columbae, and here you have the Vita Columbae. And what has to be remembered is these people, they could take nothing for granted. They had to invent ways of writing. They had to invent the letter forms. They had to invent punctuation. In fact, the Irish seem to have been really to the fore in the invention of punctuation. For instance, the Roman texts didn't even separate the words. They just rolled on as a continuous block of writing. But here we invented, or we began to use at any rate, and probably did invent, the separation of words and then the use of punctuation. And I just use this particular page because it contains the name of Drumholm or Dorsum Tome. That is the oldest written form of any name from anywhere in Donegal surviving. Now, and I have to add in my ad that I've just written a book about Adavnon, so my head is full of stuff about Adavnon. Now, there are lots of other manuscripts that deal with Columcille. In the earlier lecture, I spoke about the Middle Irish life of Columba, which was written in Derry in about 1150 or thereabouts. And it's a sermon for preaching on the 9th of June. And we have a number of manuscripts and indeed recensions, that word I used earlier on, for the Baha Columcille, for this Middle Irish life. And it was produced in the Monastery of Derry, for which we have the earlier map. And then later, I spoke in the earlier lecture about the Baha Columcille made by Manus O'Donnell at his castle of Cashel-Port na Trinawad in 1532, and that's now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford with its wonderful frontispiece page. And I just mentioned where that was, where it was over there at the junction of the River Finn and Mourne and Foyle, and that's what the manuscript now looks like. And that indeed we think that it was Manus's intention to have that produced in the most modern, up-to-date fashion, which was, of course, as a printed book. Now, one of the other manuscripts of the Baha Columba, the Baha Columba, Manus O'Donnell's Baha Columcille, the major manuscript is in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, but we have other versions of it, other recensions and manuscripts, and one of them was compiled here in Columcille. We also know that there were scribes producing manuscripts again relating to St Colmcille on Tory Island. And we know, for instance, that Kilmacrennan, the monastery, the ancient monastery of Kilmacrennan. Now, what you're looking at there is the later medieval monastery, but in the ancient monastery of Kilmacrennan, there was a book of Kilmacrennan, and we know something about the contents of that. There were genealogies in it, there were poems in it, and there was a chronicle in it. And we know that because it's although the book itself has been destroyed and has disappeared, we know that because of the way it was quoted in other texts. And the same is true of Raphoe. We know that there were a number of medieval manuscripts produced in Raphoe, and we know the nature of the text. There are a number of texts, particularly relating to Adavnon or Aunon or Unan, as he's now, and that there would seem to be at least one, if not more, manuscript kept in Raphoe and probably written. There are texts certainly written in Raphoe in the Middle Ages, which dealt with St Colmcille and with St Aunon. Now, I mentioned Adavnon's Vita Columbae, the copy you're looking at. Is now in a library in Switzerland, in Schaffhausen, but the manuscript was made on Iona about the year 700. And in this instance, it's telling a story about a man called Lashrain, and I'll come back to Lashrain in a minute. And again, in the earlier lecture, I mentioned that Adavnon quotes from an earlier book by a man called Comenius Albus, or in Latin, that's his name in Latin, Irish is Comena Find. Now, Comena, this is all that's the small lettering, not the large letter. The small lettering is the only part of Comenius's book that survives. Comenius' book survives. And that is the oldest piece of writing that we know of from County Donegal, that comes from a Donegal author. That's the oldest piece we know of what you're looking at there, the small letters. And here is another story in Adavnon's life about a monk called Finan. And I won't go into all the details of that now, but on this genealogy, we can see Lashrain there, 603, the man mentioned in the earlier story. We can see Comena here, 669. who was the writer of the book, the Liber de Virtutibus Sancti Columba, the Book of the Miracles of St Columba. And then on the edge, we can see there Finan Raha, Finan of Rye, in the church near Ray, near Falcara. And so all these, almost certainly that Finan is the man mentioned by Adamnan in his text about the story about a battle in County Derry. So you can see and all these people come from a little kingdom called Ceinial Dubh. Ceinial Dubh eventually disappears, but it's still there in the 6th and 7th centuries. And they produced a number of, all these people with dates are all abbots of Iona and then Finan Raha. So so that area, and our principal church seems to have been the church now known as Rye. That seems to be a major centre of scholarship and learning as well. Now, going back to Adamnan's manuscript, here is a whole story tells us about an apple tree down in Durrow in County Offaly. It produces bitter fruit, and then Columba blesses it, and the fruit is sweet. Here's another story in which a man is falling from the roof of a house in Durrow, and so on and so forth. And so that's a manuscript of the 7th century with the text of Adamnan's Iona, Vita Columbae. Now, a later manuscript, and I mentioned this earlier, of the Vita Columbae from the 12th century. So this is it's a different manuscript, and it's a different recension, if you remember that word. But this contains, very interestingly, details of Columba's genealogy, and this was preserved in Durham Cathedral, as I said, a descendant of the monastery of Lindisfarne. And if those manuscripts hadn't survived, we wouldn't know anything about Columba's genealogy. That's just a part of the Adamnan's the Schaffhausen manuscript of Adamnan's Vita Columbae, talking about the foundation of the monastery of Durrow. And Durrow is the only monastery in Ireland that we can say with absolute certainty was founded by Columba. Now, one of the great, I should say the cross you're looking at there is 9th century, but one of the great treasures of Durrow is the Book of Durrow. And it dates, we can't put an absolute date, it's somewhere between about 650 and 750. And these books we talk about, the Book of Lindisfarne, the Book of Durrow, and so on and so forth, they're essentially gospel books. They're copies of the 4 gospels primarily. Now, they draw their art inspiration. If you look, that's the manuscript. And here's a little piece of jewelry found from roughly the same period. And you can see there's a crossover in the decorative styles between them. This is also the page from the Book of Durrow. And you can see there's a hole in the manuscript. And vellum was very expensive, so even if there was a hole in it, they couldn't just throw it out. It was very expensive in terms of time. This is one of what we call the carpet pages, a page that there's no words on it, just pure decoration, but the decoration is just exquisite. This is another carpet page. Here's a mixture of interlace and animals. Another carpet page. And then, as I mentioned, these books are primarily books of the Gospels. And each Gospel is introduced by a symbol. This is the page which shows the symbol of St. Matthew. Here's the symbol of, that's the title there. That's the symbol of St. John, not the symbol of St. Matthew. The previous one was Matthew. This one is St. John. I don't know what's happened there. This is the symbol of St. Mark. The lion of St. Mark. If you go to St. Mark's Square in Venice, you see the great lions, and the lions were the symbol of Mark. And here is the calf, or the symbol of St. Luke. Now, the Book of Durrow is one of our earliest, magnificently illuminated or decorated books. And of course, it comes from the only monastery that we can say with certainty was founded by Columba. The other great manuscript, decorated manuscript from a Columban monastery, is the book of what we now call the Book of Kells. It had various names in the past, but it was certainly known as the Suscail Mór Columcille, the great gospel book of Columcille. And then one of the texts describes it as Príomh Mynd Iarraidh, the greatest treasure of the Western world. And what you're looking at on the screen, the picture is folio 184, and it's a folio is if you like an opening in a book. That's, in other words, 2 pages, one each side. So that's what a folio is. And this is folio 188 or recto. And it's the beginning of the Gospel of St. Luke. And it's just one word, quoniam, inasmuch. But the decoration is just magnificent. And there's all sorts of details. We could spend hours just discussing it. But before I do that, I want to just say a few facts about the Book of Kells. So the Book of Kells, like these other manuscripts, the Book of Durrow, the Book of Armagh, the Book of Lindisfarne, and so on and so forth, were essentially copies of the 4 Gospels. Now, there are other materials written into them, and in the Book of Kells, a famous section called the Charters of the Book of Kells. There are 340 folios, that's openings, a 2-page opening, each page about 13 inches by 10 inches. There are about 30 folios missing. We know we can work that out, that there are about 30 missing. So it's a huge book. I mean, it's over 700 pages long. It's made from vellum, which is the skin of very young or aborted calves. Sometimes they deliberately aborted calves to get very high quality vellum. They needed about 180 calves to make the Book of Kells. And in order to have done that, they would have needed a herd of about 1,200 cattle. So you can see this is, you know, have to be fairly wealthy in contemporary terms. There were 4 different scribes, that's the people who wrote the words in the Book of Kells, and there were 2 or 3 painters or illustrators. And of course, the illustrators may have been the same people as the scribes. We can't say for certain whether they were or they weren't. It would take about 1 month to produce some of the more elaborate pages, such as the famous Cairo. I'll show you that in a moment. And the date of the Book of Kells, the date we now have for it, is somewhere around between about 807 and 814. And there is a huge debate as to whether it was made in Iona or made in Kells, and it sort of swaps backwards and forwards. The latest thinking by a man called Dr. Dan McCarthy would now make it, have it made in Kells. So this is the typical page. It's the genealogy of Christ, and it's decorated in all sorts of ways, but particularly with this little warrior here at the base. Now, this is the building known as Cathach Columcille, or St Columba's house in Kells, and it seems to be that the Book of Kells may have been kept in that building in medieval times. The book is decorated in all sorts of extraordinary ways. Many of them are, you know, quite clearly deliberately meant to be amusing. They're meant to entertain us. Very often they have a kind of almost child-like, cartoon-like quality to them. And there's all sorts of jokes. In fact, there's a major article called Drolleries in the Book of Kells about these kinds of jokes in it. There are all sorts of strange animals and wonderful, many of them, by the way, animals that, for instance, I showed you earlier, the lion from the Book of Durrow. Well, of course, no one in Ireland, nobody in Durrow had ever seen a lion at the time. So they were using their imagination on the descriptions they found in Book 2. Here we have a man who is turned into a letter, and that's, again, very common. And here from Book of Kells, we have the 4 symbols of the evangelists all grouped together. Each separate gospel is then introduced by a single page showing that particular evangelist, but this is where the 4 are grouped together. This is a very interesting page. This used to be thought of as the arrest of Christ, but latest thinking is that the man on the left-hand side is St. Peter and the man on the right-hand side is St. John. Now, this page is quite extraordinary. It's one of the most fabulous pages in the whole Book of Kells. It's known as the Chi-Rho being the symbol for Christ. And the detail is remarkable. If any page, I mean, I'm reducing it now to absurdity in some ways, but this is like a child's puzzle where, you get these puzzles where you have to find 10 things that are buried in the puzzle and in the image. And this is a similar kind of page. There are all sorts of human figures, the marvelous depiction of butterflies. Possibly the best known part of that page is this image, where 2 cats, each with a mouse on their back, are chasing, as were 2 other mice who are stealing the communion hosts. And we know that that was a real problem in India. Indeed, cats were deliberately kept in monasteries to keep the mice away from eating, particularly the communion hosts. So this is another one of these jokes that are, as it were, inserted into the Book of Kells. This is a very famous page. This is the temptation of Christ. So Christ is on the temple and he's being tempted by the devil, the figure on the right-hand side in black. And here is the devil. Now, this is really interesting in all sorts of ways. First of all, the color black is used elsewhere in the Book of Kells, but in this instance, a very special, a unique paint is used, made with soot and so on, is used to depict the devil. And this may be the oldest depiction of the devil anywhere in Western art. Now, if it's not the oldest, and I can't say for absolute certain that it is the oldest, if it's not the oldest, it's certainly amongst the very oldest. So here we have another one of the unique aspects of the Book of Kells, although this may not be the most important element of it. Another page in the Book of Kells here shows the depiction of the motif of the mother and child. Now, the mother and child, of course, is well known in European art from the Renaissance, but here it's being depicted for one of the first times in Western art. The portrait of the Virgin and the baby Jesus are not particularly flattering, but they are amongst the earliest depictions of that subject. And this is interesting because in the Columban monasteries, there was a very particular honouring of women and women as mothers in particular. And indeed, Adamnan, the man who wrote the earlier manuscript I talked about, he brought into existence a law known as the Con Adamnan, the law of Adamnan, in Latin, the Lex Innocentium, the law of the innocents. And it was proclaimed at the Synod of Burr in County Offaly in the year 697. And that law was the first law we know of on the earth, in the world, for the protection of non-combatants in times of war. And the non-combatants were defined as women, children, and clerics. And later on, it became sort of narrowed just to be a law for the protection of women. But it's a very significant aspect of it. And there are many other pieces of literature. So that, again, highlight this, the importance of women, Mary as the mother of Jesus, but also in a way the mother of the world. And so the really great importance attaching to women. And the same motif occurs on a number of other works of art from the Columban world. Here I've just shown you one from what's called St. Martin's Cross of about 100. That's about the same time as the Book of Kells. here in the centre, St Martin's Cross in Iona, and it's also on another cross in Iona, St Oran's Cross. And interestingly, the only depiction that we know of in Ireland itself from the Middle Ages is on the cross at Drumcliff, County Sligo, which may not have been founded originally as a Columban monastery, but certainly from about the year 1000 onwards, it becomes a Columban monastery. So the importance of women as mothers, Mary as the mother of Jesus, Mary as the mother of the world, is an essential kind of motif. And it's almost a brand, because it's very rare in early medieval art. From Renaissance times, it becomes a much, it's all great painters depicted the mother and child. But in early medieval times, it's very rare. But it's almost a brand of the churches associated with St Colmcille. So that's just a very brief and excursion through the manuscripts associated with St Colmcille. There's much more to be said. Indeed, every single page of the Book of Kells could take us, hours to disentangle and discuss. But it's important to note that I think that many of the most important manuscripts from both Ireland and Britain in the early medieval period belong to and come from the monasteries associated with St Colmcille. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your attention.